Caledonian Elixir. Welcome to the Caledonian Elixir. This is a podcast that takes a tragic deep dive into the darkest recesses of the human condition. I'm your host Vincent, and today on the Elixir I'm going to reveal the truth of the Russo-Ukraine conflict, from the corridors of the Kremlin to the Anglo-American national security apparatus. This is the reality of what the world has been thrust into. This is World War Z. I'm going to preface this by a short description of the history between the Ukraine and Russia, as I believe our mainstream media has completely misportrayed that history, and it will help you understand the origin of the war. We respect the Ukrainian language and tradition. We desire to see their country free. Vladimir Putin. The word Ukraine, which in Russian means on the frontier, first appears in written sources in the 12th century. However, the territory of Ukraine has been a borderland between civilization for centuries. It is a place where the political and cultural sphere of the West met the nomadic peoples of the East. To add to this, the territory contained a state that would come to reshape the entire region. This is the state of Kievan Rus. Historians believe Kievan Rus, which was situated where modern-day Kiev is today, is in fact the origin of the Slavic peoples. It was founded by the Viking prince named Vladimir of Kiev, who in the 10th century ruled over a kingdom stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea. With the passage of time, the Slavic people under the Russian Empire, ruled by Catherine the Great, along with the Cossacks of Ukraine, fought alongside each other to defeat the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, then the Ottoman Empire. As a result of this cooperation of the Ukrainians and Russians being victorious over the Ottomans in the 1770s, the Russians seized control of a swath of territory stretching from Moldova to the Crimea itself. These new territories became known as Novorossiya, or in English, New Russia. With these new frontiers established, there was Novorossiya, the Ukraine and Belarus, which was known as Little Russia, and the territory east of the Don River, where the Donbass is situated, becoming known as Greater Russia. Now, the reason I'm telling you this is so that there is an understanding of the shared history and origin of the Russian and Ukrainian people. They are one people and have been for over 1,000 years. With that said, let's turn the attention to the cause of the Russo-Ukraine War, otherwise known as World War Z. I have explained in a previous episode called Masters of the World that in the second half of the 20th century, the Anglo-American globalist power apparatus targeted Russia. After the collapse of the USSR, the globalists faced a problem, not so much ideological as civilizational in nature. The abolition of a nation-state has been resisted by Russia even more since the election of Putin. Therefore, the plan to destabilize Russia would be three-pronged: through drugs, currency, then geopolitically through the overthrow of the Kremlin's international allies. Now, there are no official figures showing the full extent of drug cultivation in the nations that composed the former USSR. However, there was a new opium war against the new independent post-Soviet state of Russia, comparable to the opium wars in China. And one country caught in the crossfire to destabilise Russia was Ukraine. Once the breadbasket of Eastern Europe. In 1995 alone, Ukraine seized 50 tons of opium and amphetamine being trafficked into Russia. You see, Ukraine is a critical transshipment point for drugs and chemicals used in the manufacturing of drugs such as heroin. In addition, another border state of Russia that became a locus point for opium and heroin production is Afghanistan. And after NATO toppled the Taliban, the de facto government of Afghanistan, poppy cultivation soared, with around 8,500 tonnes being produced in 2008 alone, thereby transforming Afghanistan into a narco state, flooding Russia with cheap heroin, resulting in illness, poverty and death. Alongside drugs, a crucial step in destabilising Russia in the 90s manifested in the looting and destruction of the Russian currency, the ruble. The plan to tank the Russian currency got into gear in 1992 with the Gaidar reforms. Prices were decontrolled, inflation soared, then the dollarization of the Russian economy began. By the end of 1992, the ruble had crashed, with massive sums of Russian currency, around 300 billion, being transferred into sovereign, foreign, Swiss and Commonwealth banks. This left around 30% of Russian GDP going dark. The last phase in the destabilisation of Russia, and it is in this plan we can understand the true origin of the Russo-Ukraine war, involved the overthrow one by one of every strategic international ally of Russia. This began in 1999 in the former Yugoslavia, when NATO began their lengthy bombardment of Serbia, which led to the overthrow of Serbian President and Russian ally Slobodan Milosevic. The next Russian ally to fall was President Eduard Shevardnadze, who was the pro-Kremlin president of Georgia. His overthrow occurred in the Western-backed Rose Revolution of 2003. After that, the next piece to be taken was Libya, when in 2011 President Muammar Gaddafi, a Kremlin ally in North Africa, was violently deposed and killed by a Western armed insurrection. After the Gaddafi, the next target was Syria. Indeed, Syria is home to the Russian Tatar military base, the most important military asset of Russia in the Middle East. And it is here we arrive at the beginning of the Russia-Ukraine war. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be an empire. Zbigniew Brzezinski. 2014 was a political, military and economic crossroads for Ukraine. The democratically elected president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, was faced with the decision of signing either the EU association agreement or accepting a $15 billion loan from Russia. In the end, Yanukovych opted to sign the agreement with Russia. In addition, the Crimean naval base of Sevastopol, which was home to the Russian Black Sea Fleet, including more than 300 ships and over 25,000 Russian servicemen. But it was not a sovereign Russian base, rather it was leased to the Russian government from Kiev, with that lease incidentally being up for review in 2014. So when President Yanukovych approved the continued leasing of the base by the Russians, it forfeited any chance of NATO seizing control of Sevastopol. Moreover, as far as the globalists were concerned, it was a signal that Yanukovych had sided with the Russian Federation, and like Russia's other allies, he now had to go. In a matter of months, Western-backed protests started in the Ukrainian capital, Kiev. US Secretary of State Victoria Nuland and Senator John McCain visited Kiev, stirring up protesters and declaring Anglo-American support for protests. Now, Robert Kagan, husband to Victoria Nuland, had co-founded the Project for a New American Century, which outlined the plan for regime change in Iraq. So that gives you an idea of the circle Nuland is involved with. Now, Nuland and her neocon allies saw the protests as an opportunity to overthrow the Russian ally Yanukovych. The neocon Karl Gershman explained the plan a year earlier, calling Ukraine the biggest prize and the step towards toppling Putin. In December 2013, violence erupted across Kiev between right sector and nationalist right-wing group and the government. The violence would escalate crescendoing in February 2014 when snipers opened fire on protesters in the Maidan. Over the next 2 days, 77 were killed. During this, Nuland and European officials backed by right sector neo-nationalists arranged an unconstitutional procedure removing President Yanukovych from power. Nuland reminded Ukrainian elites that the US government had invested $5 billion in Ukraine and that she wanted to have an integral role in the selection of the next government, with her choice to be the next Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. But that wasn't enough for the anti-Yanukovych forces, who, led by right sector and neo-Nazi militia, overran government buildings, forcing Yanukovych and other officials to flee for their lives. With armed militias patrolling the corridors of power, the final step to regime change was laid. While Nuland and her neocon cohort celebrated, Putin, who recognised the strategic threat this new regime posed to the Russian naval base at Sevastopol in Crimea, quickly acted by deploying over 20,000 troops along the border of Crimea and Ukraine, then holding referendum in Crimea on whether to join the Russian Federation. At this some point in the Donbass region, these ethnic Russians, around 10 million of them, who had been Yanukovych's political base, resisted what they perceived as the overthrow of their elected president. As a result of this, the two regions of the Donbass, Donetsk and Luhansk, declared their independence from Ukraine. In Russian-speaking cities across Ukraine, popular support for the separatists and anger towards the new Kiev government was growing. In the Donbass, a series of military skirmishes between the separatists and Ukrainian nationalist militias made it obvious that Donetsk and Luhansk would only be brought under control of Kiev by a full-scale military operation. I think the task of the future is to explore the domain of evil until not a shred of mystery is left. Henry Miller. The new Anglo-American client president of Ukraine, Poroshenko, began mobilising the army. Fighting alongside the army was the Azov Battalion, an ultra-nationalist militia. A few of the militias, like the armed wing of Right Sector, were the self-declared military wing for Ukrainian political parties. And by June 2014, there's a war in the Donbass. Now, after a year of fighting in the Donbass, the EU and Russian forces mediated the Minsk Accords. This was a framework for peace between the separatists in the Donbass and Ukraine. However, a key stumbling point for Ukraine in the Minsk Accords had been the measure of holding referenda in the Donetsk-Luhansk national republics on whether the people of the newly declared independent republics wished to remain part of Ukraine. In spite of this, the Poroshenko government of Ukraine refused to give up that measure. The most passionate opposition came from hardline Ukrainian nationalist militias. One important figure opposing the Minsk agreement was Andrew Belitsky, the commander of the far-right Azov Battalion, who pressured the Ukrainian government not to sign any agreement with Donetsk-Luhansk, or the Kremlin. Instead, Kiev was to take the region by force. There's a lot of talk of off-ramps for Putin. We want to close off the off-ramps. US Army General H.R. McMaster. In the hands of the globalist Anglo-American power apparatus is the entire US military machine and the management of NATO. In addition to this, almost all the giants of big tech are subordinate to them. So when in the winter of 2020, Biden and the Democrats wrestled victory from Trump in the battle for the White House, it signalled to the world the return to a unipolar globalist agenda by the White House. As a result, once again, the Putin government in Russia began to take new measures against this political threat. For God's sake, Putin cannot remain in power. Joe Biden. Russia's complaints over NATO expansion to Russia's borders, its resistance to an Anglo-American unipolar world order, and the continued fighting between Ukrainians and separatist ethnic Russians in the Donbass, that by 2021 had left 15,000 dead, continued to fall on deaf ears in the West. By the winter of 2021, the elements necessary for a full-scale invasion of Ukraine were set in place. Despite military preparations, however, kicking into gear, Russian Foreign Secretary Lavrov was seeking a diplomatic resolution. Russia demanded NATO end their deployment of missiles, heavy weaponry to Ukraine, and an agreement that Ukraine would remain out of NATO, and a resolution to the fighting in the Donbass, along with some demands of NATO troop deployment concentrations near the border. However, we know now that the UK and US had pressured President Zelensky in early April not to negotiate peace with President Putin, tanking a preliminary peace deal, according to Fiona Hill, US National Security Advisor for Russian and European Affairs. She stated in a defence article, Russian and Ukrainian negotiators appeared to have agreed on the outlines of a negotiated interim settlement. Fiona Hill. This was echoed by Ukrainska Pravda, a Ukrainian media outlet, reiterating that peace deals with Russia in early April were mediated with Germany and France. However, peace and cooperation between President Putin and Zelensky was and is not what the US and UK ultimately wanted. Their goal is regime change in the Kremlin, enveloping Russia under the dominion of Anglo-American global power, thereby shaping the political, social and economic agenda of Russia. At the same time, the Anglo-American powers want to wrestle the Crimea from Russia. You see, the Crimea and the Russian base of Sevastopol is a strategic geopolitical linchpin. It is the reason the British Empire, French Empire and the Third Reich have all attempted to seize control of the territory. In short, if Ukraine were to capture Crimea, NATO would inevitably attain a presence in the territory. Therefore, it is in the interests of Russian national security to prevent this at all costs. So here we are, almost 1 year into the Russo-Ukraine war. From the Russian perspective, it is to protect the peoples living in the Donbass and to demilitarise the neo-nationalists in Ukraine. From the perspective of Ukraine, it is a war of freedom, of survival. The battle insignia Z, painted on Russian armour, is a symbol of the greater existential conflict we are all being pulled into. World War Z. It is a war that is stealing the wealth of nations. The working, ordinary peoples have nothing to gain from this war, but everything to lose. Populations are becoming poorer, with energy and food costs rising. Yet weapons contractors, the military-industrial complex, receives tens of billions, sending Neptune missiles, HIMARS missiles, Javelin missiles, Patriot missiles, battle tanks, cluster bombs to Ukraine. Our politicians with weapon contractors have become the merchants of death. Peace sells, but no one is buying. Peace, a negotiated peace, would end this war. That would be great. However, everything great is just as difficult to realise as it is rare to find. Especially when the media around you will not stop beating the war drums. Hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced. The price of war. Our illusions are hundreds of thousands dead and a lost future for millions. And most ominously of all, this war has opened up a Pandora's box that may scorch the earth on fire, plunging us all into nuclear war. And if you think that is hyperbole, well, at this moment, the US is providing Ukraine with missiles and drones, training them how to use those missiles, then providing them with a satellite geolocation info, resulting in Russian nuclear bomber bases being hit deep in Russia. We must stop this before it escalates to a point where we can't come back. So I will leave you with this quote, as I think it is poignant and sums up where the world finds itself today. Since Auschwitz, we know what man is capable of, and since Hiroshima, we know what is at stake. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you learned something and enjoyed, and I'll catch you later.